Si sente? Sì. Si sente? Sì. Buongiorno, benvenuti a tutti, grazie per la vostra presenza a questa seconda sessione di Politicall, la nostra scuola di politica in cui cerchiamo di entrare nei contenuti profondi delle cose, quindi ci diamo spazio di approfondimento, ci diamo relazioni autorevoli e spazio per il confronto. La volta scorsa abbiamo avviato la nostra edizione affrontando la giustizia sociale con il dottor Federico Reo, che ci ha introdotto a una prospettiva europea sulla giustizia sociale. Tutta l'edizione è in collaborazione con il Martens Center, questo importantissimo think tank del Partito Popolare Europeo. E poi con il dottor Zamagni ci siamo stati introdotti a una prospettiva filosofico-economica della giustizia sociale, entrando un po' in quella che è l'esigenza, così come è insorta, ma non voglio rubare spazio al nostro ospite di oggi che adesso vi presento. E comunque, diciamo, come idea abbiamo cominciato ad affacciarci all'origine della giustizia sociale, che si pone con l'urbanizzazione, quindi con l'acuirsi dell'esigenza di solidarietà fra le persone, di ripartizione appunto giusta delle risorse che il mondo e la società offre e permette di produrre. E quindi abbiamo capito che è giusto che la solidarietà sia istituzionalizzata, ma esiste il rischio forte dell'assistenzialismo, che non solo limita l'efficienza di questa allocazione, ma va proprio contro l'uomo, nel senso che rischia di indebolire i legami di solidarietà fra le persone, di vicinanza, di comunanza. E quindi, come sempre avviene in questa scuola, abbiamo visto la complessità dei problemi e oggi ci aiutiamo ad approfondirla con il dottor Peter Hefele, che ringrazio moltissimo per essere con noi, che è il Policy Director del Martens Center e che ci aiuterà ad entrarci ancora di più nella prospettiva appunto europea della giustizia sociale sotto tutti i suoi profili di complessità che questo comporta. Allora io lascerei senz'altro la parola a lui e vi ricordo che abbiamo le cuffie per la traduzione, perché l'intervento sarà in inglese, con la nostra dottoressa Elisa Salemi, che ringrazio, e vi chiedo quindi di aver cura delle cuffie e di lasciarle poi nella pausa anche sulla vostra sedia. Le useremo, abbiamo un coffee break alla fine della lezione e avremo poi il dibattito prima di pranzo. Allora vi ringrazio e lascio senz'altro la parola al dottor Peter Hefele. Prego.
Buongiorno e mille grazie per l'invitazione. I switch to English if you apologize. I understand Italian quite well, but speaking I prefer still in Inglese. Well, I'm very honored to be welcomed and invited, and it's my first time in this lovely city of Torino, which it's a reason to become and be back. Well, I'm always grateful for this cooperation of the Wilfried Martens Center. As you already know, it's the official think tank of the European People's Party. The European People's Party is the largest political family in Europe. It's a Christian democratic, it's a conservative liberal party. We have members from more than 50 different parties. It's a huge family, and maybe later I will talk a bit more about also the upcoming European elections, because you know on the 9th of June we are going to elect a new parliament, the European Parliament, and this is an important and interesting time. And some of the topics we are going to discuss today are part of the discussion in the election program, for example. So this is not just a philosophical consideration. What we are going to talk today has very much concrete consequences for how we, example, draw our election program and what is important for the electors in Europe in a couple of months ago. I'm very delighted to be here because I also started to work in the field of political education, as we call it in Germany. I worked for many years with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, which is the largest political education in Germany. I started in their department of political education, which has the same ideas and objectives as you do, because to train young people to be part of a society, to be engaged in political activities. And then I went abroad for many years. I lived in Asia for more than 10 years, in China in particular. So a lot of things we're going to discuss today has not only a domestic dimension, it has also very much international dimension, and this is an interesting topic to discuss. Yes, the topic of social justice, which I'm invited to talk a bit, it's a fascinating one, and it's a hard nut to crack in 60 minutes because it goes into so many different political fields: economic policy, international politics, the new challenges of digitalization, of AI. So there's hardly any field in society which is not in one or the other way affected by ideas and challenges for social justice. And what I want to do with you during my presentation, but also in the discussion we have afterwards, is to introduce a bit into the complexity of social justice and what solutions we can find, hopefully, for some very concrete challenges. So combining a bit the theory with very concrete policy fields. You hear a lot about the social justice, in particular in times of elections. Many parties promise to go after social justice, but in reality it's not as easy to do, and be very careful if somebody is promising he has found the solution to solve all these problems of social justice. The thing is unfortunately much more complex, and I would like to show you a bit and introduce you a bit into the complexity, because only with this background you can then understand very concrete challenges in practical life. So, what I'm going to do today is I will give you some ideas what are basic elements when we talk about social justice. The next is I took 3 very concrete dimensions when we talk about social justice. This is an issue of intergeneration relations, the relations, for example, between young and old people in a society. Then I will go into global issues, because a lot of discussions we have these days on social justice go way beyond the national societies, the national borders. They are issues of international relations as well. And the last is very interesting, and I will explain what I mean with transformational. Our societies are undergoing dramatic changes, be it due to the climate change issue, the way we produce and consume. So there's our society, which has evolved over 150 years, 200 years. Industrial society will dramatically change in the next decades. And this comes along with a lot of challenges, and social justice is definitely one we have to consider. Yeah, and the last, and for me the interesting part, is of course to discuss with you, to see what you have questions, what kind of questions you have, and what kind of challenges your society has, and how we can discuss this and put it in a wider framework of social justice. So, you mentioned that we have a challenge which is nothing new. It has a long history in European thinking, and I will go back a bit into the thinking in Europe, what social justice is. We come all from a background of Christian democratic thinking, conservative or liberal thinking, and the debates started at latest in the 19th century about social justice. This is nothing new insofar, and it's nothing which is left with the socialists, for example, because these political movements have always claimed they stand for social justice. This is simply not true, because if you look into the debates in the 19th century, it was Christian democratic thinkers, even conservative thinkers who had dealt a lot with the challenge of social justice. So be careful, the left has not a monopoly for the discussions on social justice. We can be proud, and it is at least as long as the socialists discuss that, we Christian Democrats discuss these topics. Well, I mentioned the three dimensions, the intergenerational one, the global one, and the transformational one. And as I mentioned before, in each I will put a bit of theory in it and then combine it with a very concrete example so that you can imagine. But there might be other examples, and I hope that we can discuss these in the course of our lecture. I will not limit my discussions to pure economic issues. I'm an economist by profession, and so issues of social redistribution and justice is always very much at the heart of each economic thinking. But it is much wider, because at the very end, if you go into the core of a social justice issue, it's about distributing or redistributing resources, societal resources. And this goes way beyond just economic issues. And I will also close my presentation with an outlook on the European election I mentioned before. On the 9th of June, we have the next European elections. This is a big issue for us, very decisive in many ways. And we will see what our topics of today will play in this debate. As I mentioned, social justice has always been a core issue of any political thinking in Western philosophy and Western political thinking. When we go back to the ancient Greek philosophies, they started basically, Aristotle, for example, started with thinking, what are the principles of a society? How can we organize a just society? And this is the very starting of thinking about what we these days call social justice as well. And if you look into the major religions of the Western Hemisphere, all the monotheistic religions from Judaism to Christianity and Islam even, issues of justice, of social justice, are very much in the core of their thinking. They often originated as an answer to issues of injustice to a large extent. So we have a lot of sources in Western philosophy. What I cannot touch today is going beyond Europe and the Western Hemisphere, because, as I mentioned, I lived many years in Asia, and yes, there's also a discussion from a different perspective, but that would definitely go way too much. So I will concentrate on the Western thinking, which is rich enough and goes now indeed in a global way. Yes, back to history. The whole debate of what we call social justice these days is probably an issue which started in the late 18th century, both with the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution. These are those major Big Bang events which triggered the discussion, and a lot of these issues we are going to discuss till today started 250 years ago, and they still constitute the framework how we think about social justice. We can debate later on whether this framework is too narrow and has been adjusted or has to be adjusted in the future, because our societies will undergo dramatic changes. But for a lot of problems, this is still the framework which is still valid and which we have to discuss. And if you go through the European history of the last 200 years, all the major turmoils, revolutions, yes, at the very end, had been linked to questions of social justice. We have learned that current and certain political systems had apparently not been able to solve issues of social justice. Certain economic systems had not been capable to transform quickly enough. And so this caused a lot of revolutions if you go through from the 19th century till the late 20th century. The challenge of talking about social justice, it's a rather vague terminology. This has advantages. Politicians, for example, like to use rather vague expressions because they give them a bit of opportunity to maneuver and not to be nailed down to the wall very concretely. Yes, this is an advantage, but on the other side, it's a challenge as well, because if you try to be more precise about this topic, this is a huge disadvantage if you can't define it. But it's not only politicians which deal with this issue of being not so precise. I think if I ask you what you think about social justice on a very general level, I think we will come to a consensus very soon. But if we go down to very concrete instruments or policy fields, this will be often very divisive, very controversial. So it's not just the politics we have to blame, it's each of us who has different ideas, and the challenge in a society is how to bring these different positions together and to find a kind of consensus. I just collected, and don't be overwhelmed by this text, I just collected the sum of the definitions which you currently find, and I will immediately go through these different issues because there are some elements in these definitions which creates a kind of framework and which we have to debate if we talk about social justice. I will provide this presentation later on to all of you, so you have more time to read through, don't worry. I will immediately go into the topics which I think are very important. So this is the theoretical part a bit, but don't worry, I put it as simple as it could be possible. So we start with an issue that is on one hand simple, but it's very important because we do not talk about social justice if it's an interpersonal relation. If we try to define our relation, this is something which has also ethical issues, but we normally don't put this under an issue of social justice, because if we talk about social justice, it's about larger, complex societies and social entities. And it is indeed no surprise that we started to think about social justice when the modern societies, the modern industrial societies emerged, because these are large, it's mass societies, it's very complex societies. It's not a society we have in the Middle Ages, very well-structured societies with different layers and groups of societies. These modern societies are heavily dynamic and complex, and that's the reason why these issues of social justice started in the late 18th century, because modern European societies had its roots in this period. The next thing is, it's not just about personal relations. It goes, and this is the big challenge in this discussion, it goes into institutions. It's more an issue of abstract settings of a society. It's institutions, it's structures. It can be the economic structure, it can be technology, it can be legal structures. So this is something which goes beyond a pure personal relation. This is institutionalized, and that's where politics matters, because we are talking about defining and reframing these institutions of a society. And then, yes, comes unfortunately a challenge. If you have these institutions which are a bit abstract and it goes beyond your personal relation, then we have to ask, who is acting, who is responsible for the results, who sets the objectives of a society? Modern societies, unfortunately, are very abstract entities. This is nothing of a small-scale entity of a little village. These are millions of people living in one society, and how to organize these interactions of people on a large scale is a big challenge, and social justice has to define in one or the other way how these objectives are set, how the persons interact, and who is responsible for the very issue. Because a lot of the political debates are around, well, we have a situation, we have a development, but who is to blame for? And it's very difficult to nail down one specific person to say he is the one who is guilty. This is the result often out of a very complex interaction, makes it even more difficult to define who is indeed to blame. Another issue is that social justice is not something which is limited to only one specific policy field. As I mentioned before, the fascinating thing is it's not just about economics, it's about legal systems, it's about social justice, international relations. So wherever you go in politics, there is a dimension of social justice, fascinating from an analytical point of view, but even very difficult if you want to address it in a political manner and to find solutions, because if you find one instrument which might help in one policy dimension, it can have devastating results in another. So understanding how these different policy fields interact is indeed an intellectual challenge, but it's even a bigger challenge for politicians, for example, who have to decide on certain measures. And yes, if there is one principle which we can apply and think, oh, this is a perfect solution for one policy field, does it really work for others? So this is the challenge of drafting and crafting politician and political decision makers. And the next question, of course, is if you have found a solution, is it shared by all members of the society? If not, we have a highly divisive issue, and we have to find also a way to find a consensus in a society. Democratic societies have elections, which is one mechanism to find the solutions. Other dictatorships, for example, impose simply solutions from above. So there are different ways you can solve this issue. You can have a bottom-up, a more democratic approach, or you, as China or Russia or other authoritarian regimes, say, we just impose a measure on you and you have to accept it, or you're kicked out. Then indeed, and I will talk about some examples later on, if we have an idea of what social justice is, by which means and which instruments are we going to implement this policy? And how can we look after a certain period of time, for example, whether this policy was effective or not? What have been the consequences? How can we measure the impact and the achievements in a society? And in complex societies, the problem is that the effects are quite different in different parts of the society, for example. So this is an issue to evaluate, to make clear whether politics is really interesting or not. And the last issue is that social justice is not something you can fix and you say you have a certain definition and this rests for the rest of the universe. This is under constant change, and that is the big challenge. You have permanently reinterpret and analyze what is changing and find new answers. So this is like shooting on a moving target. And if you compare the discussions we had in the 19th century about social justice, they are to a large extent totally different from what we have in the very early decades of the 21st century. So social justice is not something which is stable and we can define and nail down once and for all. It is an ongoing, moving target, and that's the reason why we have so fierce debates, because it's not something you agree once and then it's done for the rest of the life. And at the very end, and this is to close up a bit, it's about an idea what a society should look like. It's a social vision. We should not underestimate the importance of having an idea of how a society should look like, and that's all about, if we talk about social justice, there is at the very end an idea of a society, how it should be organized, according to which principles it should be organized. This is another definition at the very end of social justice, an idea of a society we have. So after these 8 points, which I think creates a kind of matrix to analyze all the issues, I will follow now a bit with very concrete examples. And as I mentioned, I start, no, we are not yet here, sorry. I leave this for your consideration. I start with some examples of social justice, and I would like to show you how wide the political horizon is. And as I mentioned, I start with this intergenerational issue, and in the afternoon we have another issue about the family, for example, and welfare, and this is part of the story. As you all know, we are undergoing dramatic demographic changes in the Western societies, almost the last 100 years. You know the dramatic factor in declining of fertility, longevity and aging societies, and in recent years, massive migration from also non-European regions. These are forces which will dramatically change the face and the core elements of our societies. And one of the topics we are currently debating is how can we keep this society, or the societies in Europe, for example, together? Because many are afraid that these are forces which will totally divide our societies, which will lead to massive clashes within society, and everybody is very much concerned how to keep the shop together, keep a coherent society. And yes, the issue of social justice is a major topic because we are talking about solidarity between generations, and solidarity also means at the same time a kind of burden sharing. Who is burning which part of the adjustment? The traditional answer was in Europe after the Second World War the introduction of modern welfare systems. And this was based on the idea that we have a resource allocation, the younger generation pays into the system, and when they're getting old, they get the sources out. This is very simple, it's much more complex, but this was basically the simple idea of an intergenerational transfer of resources. Well, this doesn't work any longer because the young generation is getting too small, the people are living longer. So we have a huge issue of redistribution between different generations. The younger generations claims, oh, the burdens get much too high because our shoulders are getting smaller and the burdens of the older generation gets higher. On the other side, the young generation claims for good reasons, and I think in Italy this is a good example, that they do not have access to labor markets, they often are in front of closed doors, they have no future perspective, they are less paid. Youth unemployment is one big issue. On the other side, you can argue that the exclusion of old age workforce, for example, is another problem because we exclude a lot of people, and I think this should be adjusted in the future, that we have to think about what work, for example, means in the future society. This is not the definition we had from our industrial societies, where people went into the labor market at the age of 18 or 20 and get out at the age of 60 or 65. I think these things have dramatically changed. So we have to think about the idea of work, how you can create value in a society and how to redistribute. Because yes, at the very end, it's also about discussing distributions between different parts of the society, which is a core debate in all kind of social justice issue. And a more recent one is, for example, the migration issue. And combined with this, the integration issue. So how can we integrate people? What is their contribution to a society? What are the preconditions to get people from also non-European context into our societies? And as we know, it's a very divisive topic. We are far from any kind of social consensus how these migration processes should work. And this, you will see in the next European elections, will be a huge issue and not the most delightful one, I must tell you. So this is just a short example of what it means if you apply social justice principles to the question how generations can work together and how burdens are shared among them. The second I mentioned is the global dimension, because we can no longer talk about social justice within a nation state or a national societies. A lot of these issues, which I will mention in a second, go way beyond national borders. They are at the very end global challenges. But on the other side, all the political systems and social welfare systems, for example, we developed over the last 150 years to contribute and to solve issues of social justice, they had all been designed within the border of a nation state. I talk about Europe a bit later, but till today, the major focus is on the nation state if we talk about social justice. And all the political debates are still very much national debates. But as we know, there are some issues which we cannot solve any longer. And think about the climate change issue or even the distribution of wealth on a global scale. These are more recent examples where we have learned that this doesn't work any longer. We cannot find solutions on the national state, neither in Italy, nor in Germany, nor in Belgium. This is something even the European Union is too small to solve. So we have to go on a global issue. The challenge here is what is the framework, the political framework to address these challenges? Yes, we have the United Nations, we have all these international law regulations, and they talk about social justice as well. But if you look who is really acting, who is responsible, who has really the power to implement these kind of political measures, then you find there is hardly anybody beyond the national state who is really effective in implementing. Even the European Union has its limits in this respect. And then, of course, we run into this huge problem that ideas of social justice are very much culturally determined. We all argue against a background of Western European philosophy and Western European values. If you go beyond that region, maybe the North Atlantic is something which still works because we share the same cultural heritage. But as I mentioned, if you go to Africa or to Asia, you find different norms, cultural values, and they very much define how people think about social justice. So if you operate on a global level, you have often a conflict of different political norms, cultural norms, that makes things not easier to find a consensus to solve issues of social justice on a global level. Europe has an important role to play, but we have also to acknowledge that we are not the only one in the pond, so that there are other players now, more important players, and to find a consensus on global level is one of the biggest challenges I think we have in the next years. And then the third and last point is that what I called transformational justice. Sounds a bit theoretical, but what I mean is that we are undergoing a dramatic change in the way we produce and we consume. Our patterns and our structures in our societies are at the very end, or had been in the very end developed in the 19th century. This is the answer of a modern industrial society we found, and we're still in that period. If you hear a lot about post-industrial societies, that is simply not true. We are still very much in an industrial society, even, and Torino is a good example, even if the economic structure has dramatically changed, but all the institutions we have created, they are very much more or less the same as in the 19th century, whatever others might talk. So that is probably not longer the case. We are at the brink, at the beginning of a completely, and I would say it's a rather revolutionary change which our societies have to undergo. And all the solutions we have found in the last 150 years to deal with social justice might not longer work at all under new circumstances, so we have to redefine some of them. And as you know, this affects our societies in the core of the societies, but it affects also our relations to external partners. Let me give you a very concrete example. If we talk about the green transformation, you know, this is this big project which has been invented in Brussels and elsewhere, and it's about moving our societies into a low carbon emission society, getting rid of fossil societies and replace them with renewables. This is a short story of a longer story. But this thing is already difficult in our own societies, because if you replace the energetic basis, then some people might face a lot of losses. Take the example of Poland. If you have a region where coal is produced, and now you tell these guys, well, in 10, 15 years, we do not longer produce coal, you have a huge issue of social unrest, of unemployment. You have to compensate people for the losses of this transformation. Other regions, of course, might profit from this transformation if they go in modern technology. But you see, there are some questions which are very practical and which have to be solved. And go beyond Europe. If we now impose a tax on goods which have a high emission intensity, which are produced in India, for example, in China, with a lot of fossil energy, and the European Commission has said, no, we have to put some taxes de facto or at the border that we can compete with these, because the European industry is forced to produce at a low emission level, which is more expensive to deal. So then you have immediately the challenge, are we closing our borders? What is the opportunities for others to do trade with us, which has a huge impact on their wealth, for example. So you see, there is a chain of reactions for decisions made in Europe, and they are all related to an issue: is it just, is it fair, or do we on one side impose burdens which are not meant for others to be? So, and how can we compensate those parts of the societies who are heavily suffering from the decline of certain industries and cannot participate in modern service-based society production, for example? So this is just a very concrete example of what it can really mean. As I had been asked also to make a few words on the European Union, because I'm working in Brussels as an advisor for European politics, I will put some thoughts and close with some thoughts of what it means for the upcoming elections, to what extent our topic of social justice is being dealt in this issue. Well, first of all, we have to ask, what has the European Union to do with social justice? Is it not something which is solely still with the national level, with Italy, with Germany, with Belgium or Sweden? Because originally the European Union was not designed as a project for social justice. It was very much an economic project to unite markets, to create a single market. Later on, yes, we extended a bit the idea of what Europe should be. And as you know, Europe is quite diverse. It's one of the regions which has the hugest diversity, which comes along, of course, with a lot of different values, different societies. But yes, if you look in the polls, and we did, and Federico last time presented, for example, this study on middle classes, and we asked the people, what do you expect from Europe? What is the idea of what Europe should stand for? And then, of course, they expect that Europe, the European Union, is also contributing to what we now call social justice, to protect people from these transformational issues. And we know from all the polls that the decision made on the 9th of June, the voting, is very much influenced by how political parties give an answer to questions of social justice. This is very much ranking at the top priorities, the first or even the second. And after the war in Ukraine, these numbers have gone up. They are even more important with all the economic crisis, the inflation which comes. So issues of economic welfare, social justice has become a high political issue and has replaced, to some extent, issues of environmental protection, for example, which is still important, no doubt, but it has a bit changed the importance. In Europe, we have now invented, as we often do, Brussels is very innovative in this issue, a new slogan of Europe, for Europe that protects. This is the new message of the European Commission, to show that Europe is not just about hard economic issues, it also takes care of its citizens. Well, this is an issue we can debate longer, is whether European Union is the right place and the right level to discuss these issues. But still, Europe was, or the Commission in particular, was very active in recent years also to tap into this field of social justice. I will show you here one of the issues which they have invented. This will be given to you later on. So they deal with a lot of issues which we normally consider as social justice issue, from education to health to social cohesion to poverty reduction. You see they are quite active. One can argue whether they are too active in many fields and whether this fits into national policies as well, but you see they do something in this field. I think from my perspective as a more conservative, liberal, Christian Democrat, one of the biggest achievements in Europe was creating the single market, because this is a huge contribution to a non-discrimination, that we as European citizens can, for example, move around Europe. We are treated in more or less the same way than others in Europe. I think this is a huge, major achievement in terms of social justice against borders all around Europe and discrimination of not being a citizen. The second part in Europe is active is, of course, it tries to engage internationally, and Europe always sees it not as a hard power, as we say, not a military power, not so far, it's slightly changing now, but it is about norms and values, and Europe is in this respect very much engaging in international activities. Whether we choose the right instruments or not, I leave it for the later discussion. Yes, and the final point indeed is that the model for the European economy is the social market economy. This is the framework which is written in the treaties of Lisbon, for example. So these are two elements. We want to be competitive, yes, and we have to. And on the other side, the social well-being is also a political objective, and they are literally on the same level. In practical politics, it's often difficult, and there are a lot of trade-offs between two topics, but the idea of Europe is one of a social, market-based economy, and that means two elements: an economic perspective, a competitiveness one, and a social one. And for both, Europe should stand for. Whether we do too much of regulations or not, this is a debate I would like to have for the discussions later on. And with this, I would like to close my presentation. I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and I'm now really delighted to tap into your questions, because I want to know, of course, what is your idea about social justice. Thank you very much.
Thanks to you, Peter. Grazie moltissime. E direi che abbiamo avuto una panoramica su quanto sono complessi, quanto sono vasti e quanti sono i livelli della giustizia sociale. E quindi con questo io vi rimando al coffee break che abbiamo allestito di qua, invitandovi appunto a preparare le domande per il dibattito che ci sarà subito dopo, e al banco libri che abbiamo al fondo. Ci troviamo qui verso le 12:15, 12:20, direi, anche lasciate pure le cuffie sulle sedie. A dopo, grazie. Rieccoci, bentornati. E allora, direi che abbiamo una mezz'oretta abbondante, anche qualcosa in più, per il dibattito, e quindi direi sulla base degli spunti, ecco, che Peter ci ha introdotto, quindi dei vari livelli di complessità che abbiamo visto sui problemi della giustizia sociale, mettiamo carne al fuoco e iniziamo con le domande. Prego, dottore.
Qui? Allora, io volevo chiederle questo. Se la attuale comunità europea è nata per ragioni economiche, la questione si pone in questi termini: quale tipo di economia? L'economia politica che si è sviluppata in Occidente non è l'unica possibilità. Pare invece che non ci sia scampo. Questa economia politica nasce basandosi su un'origine filosofica che possiamo rinviare a Hobbes, e quindi a un concetto di natura umana conflittuale. Ci sarebbe un'altra possibilità. L'altra possibilità era stata in qualche modo inaugurata in Italia, a Napoli, da Antonio Genovesi, che aveva coperto la prima cattedra italiana di economia civile, non politica. L'economia civile si rifaceva per principio ad Aristotele, che vede l'uomo come naturalmente sociale. Allora, noi parliamo di giustizia sociale, ma come può andare d'accordo la giustizia sociale con un'istituzione che invece si basa su una visione dell'uomo che è contraria alla società, conflittuale? Grazie.
Peter, if you agree, we may collect some more questions. Prego.
Grazie professore per la sua esposizione e volevo complimentarmi per la sua giovialità nonostante vive a Bruxelles, che insomma non è non è la Spagna neanche l'Italia. No, volevo chiederle, un po' mi allaccio alla domanda precedente. Se una volta non era chiaro se le leggi dell'economia prevalevano sul potere politico oppure se il potere politico prevaleva sulle leggi economiche. Adesso è chiaro, sono le leggi dell'economia che prevalgono sulla politica. Quindi a questo punto, come diceva prima chi mi ha preceduto, com'è possibile avere giustizia sociale se il potere economico è detenuto da pochissime famiglie in proporzione a livello mondiale proprio, no? Grazie.
Michele, poi facciamo un giro di risposte.
Grazie per la bellissima lezione. Due affermazioni che sono state fatte mi sembrano molto importanti. La prima, quando si è detto che la giustizia sociale è determinata dalla cultura, e poi quando si è fatto riferimento agli ideali e agli ideali politici. Io vorrei approfondimento su questo, perché c'è una affermazione che è molto diffusa, è quella che le decisioni politiche siano invece da prendersi solo in base a considerazioni tecniche, quindi diciamo così neutre, ma invece mi sembra che il valore degli ideali e delle culture sia molto importante.
Peter, lascerei la parola.
Well, let's have a try. The problem you both mentioned is at the very end the issue of political control of the economic framework, and it's right in the respect that in the last decades, due to what we normally call the globalization, that the impact of the nation state as the most important regulatory framework has diminished, and we have not replaced it by any other kind of regulation on a higher level. And even the European Union is in many cases not enough. They try to regain some of the influence. If you look in the most recent political debates, for example, on the digitalization, they tried to establish a framework of norms which at least to a certain extent protects the European space. The challenge is will others accept this kind of regulation, or will we have at the very end maybe 3 or 4 totally different regions with different rules? And then we have a huge problem, because how do we coordinate the interaction between, say, the United States and Europe, or Europe and China? So to a certain extent we have to find rules which apply to all if we continue with a kind of global economy. If we do not do that, we face the danger that we will have a defragmentation. That means we fall apart. And we still believe that an open economy, an economy of exchange, is much more profitable than a closed economy. Every historical experience tells us that if you close economic systems, you will have a huge loss of wealth in the mid and long-term perspective. So Europe should stand for an open exchange with the rest of the world, but it has to implement its own rules and hopefully be still powerful enough to convince others to join this set of rules. This is a huge challenge. The other point you mentioned is about the idea of economy. What is the driving forces? And as you mentioned, it should not be just technological developments. That is currently the great danger if we talk about digitalization or AI, artificial intelligence, for example, that there is the idea there is something neutral. This is some technological development which is inevitable, which we cannot control. It is driven by algorithms, but these things are invented also by people. So there is no neutral technology at the very end. Technology is always, if you like it or not, framed and embedded in cultural norms. That's the reason why the Chinese model is a totally different one. They use more or less the same technologies, but they put it into a different political framework. And this framework is definitely not a framework we would like to have, because there the individuum, the human being, is of no value. It's just a pawn, something on the chessboard, which you can move around. And I lived 10 years in China. I dare to talk a bit about the situation. As a citizen, you have no rights. So if the leadership in Beijing thinks this is a technology we would like to introduce, they impose it. So there's no debate whether we like it. There's no debate on the negative consequences of certain political decisions, because there is no mechanism, no political system which enables people to speak freely up and to say, no, this is against our interests. We have to find a different solution. So it is always an issue of the political framework. And I fully agree that in recent years there was a lot of technocratic, say, decisions made in Brussels without considering the different realities in different parts of Europe. And we have to have a serious debate to what extent this can continue. Because if we look into the surveys, the people are very much afraid and not satisfied with a lot of these regulations coming from Brussels. There is always the illusion, these technocrats, they decide above our heads. They do not consider our reality, our needs. And we have to have a serious debate on how a new Europe should look like. And I'm fully convinced that some of the things which are currently done in Brussels have to be given back to the nation state or to the regions. It's not, by the way, it's not always the nation state which is relevant. Europe has 4 levels of decision making. It can be the local level as well. It can be the regional level. These are strong entities historically in Europe, and we have sometimes forgotten that they exist. And this is where people are at home to some extent. You are somebody which its origins or have come to Torino. This is the space, the political space you are working, or in Piedmont, or that is the space of politics which is relevant for you. Brussels is a very distant space out there, and they should really focus more on things which have to be regulated on a European level, and not going into thousands of micromanagement, micro rules, which have no relation to the reality of people. So from a more conservative point of view or Christian democratic point of view, we have to go back to an idea of Europe which clearly defines where political decisions should be made. I think too much has been given or taken, probably taken by Brussels. And yes, there is a huge political divide between different political parties. And you will see in the elections coming up. We have forces more on the left, I would say, who say we have to put more to Brussels. We have to have a more centralized approach to many political issues. I'm totally against that, because I think from a Christian democratic point of view, we have to ask which is the level where we should put decisions. And you will see, if you apply this principle, that a lot of decisions made in Europe need not to be made there. It can be solved on another level. And then we have a diversity. Yes, but this is Europe. Europe is not a homogeneous superstate. It's an entity which consists of very different entities. This is the model of Europe. And some apparently have forgotten it and think this is a new superstate, such as the United States even doesn't work, because the United States are also very disparate. And even China, if they don't like it or not, is very diverse, whatever the political leadership in Beijing says. China, this is my second home to some extent, is a continent. It's a continent as Europe is, and it's as diverse as Europe is. You have to acknowledge this diversity. Otherwise, people will give up this idea of Europe. I'm quite convinced.
Altro giro di domande. Eugenio.
grazie mille per la lezione. Mi chiedevo, ogni Stato avrà una sua matrice di quegli indici, dove quelli che è dell'ultima slide, no? E immagino che ci siano delle diversità di queste matrici. In alcuni casi un indice sarà più sviluppato in Italia o è meno sviluppato in Germania e così via. La mia domanda è, da un lato, a livello nazionale ci sono delle importanti, diciamo, disparità tra uno Stato e un altro all'interno della Comunità Europea, e se sì, diciamo, vista la premessa, cioè bisogna ridistribuire il benessere, ridistribuire la ricchezza, secondo lei qual è la strada che il Partito Popolare Europeo proporrà? Quindi noi italiani, per esempio, a cosa dobbiamo rinunciare secondo il Partito Popolare Europeo per guadagnare che cosa in termini di quegli indici di benessere che abbiamo affrontato?
Pietro.
Grazie della fotografia che è perfetta che ci ha fatto del problema. Io mi chiedevo questo, quando lei parlava ha fatto capire bene come la giustizia sociale sia un tema, diciamo, che nasce e si declina a livello nazionale e che non ha a che fare con l'economia, ma non solo con l'economia, perché ci sono tanti aspetti culturali che declinano proprio il problema della giustizia sociale. D'altra parte ha fatto capire bene come l'Europa non può ragionare a un livello nazionale, perché ovviamente è sovranazionale, quindi non può come dire, declinare il problema a livello nazionale. Quindi io mi chiedo, ma dunque l'Europa è difficile che possa essere un soggetto capace di affrontare il problema della giustizia sociale? Forse è, come stava accennando prima, una logica, diciamo, sussidiaria anche proprio dal punto di vista culturale, no? Per affrontare il tema della giustizia sociale tra Stati e Europa è come dire, un esercizio necessario, diciamo, per affrontare il tema.
Tino, prego.
Grazie Peter per la tua esposizione. Io vorrei proporre questa domanda, cioè come può il popolo dei cattolici in Europa effettuare una vera giustizia sociale incidendo proprio nell'individuo personale, nella propria storia, nella propria vita, a livello quotidiano? Grazie, thank you.
Peter, let's make a first turn of answers. One more?
Fits into this?
Prego.
Can take it. I'm fine. Okay. Or if we have more, then we
Raccogliamo ancora una domanda.
Buongiorno, la ringrazio per la lezione. Allora, la mia domanda è questa. Io mi chiedevo, dal suo punto di vista, realizzare una giustizia sociale a livello europeo, lei ritiene che questo possa comportare sempre più un progressivo schiacciamento dei diritti nazionali in nome del diritto comunitario, oppure ritiene che vi possa essere una amichevole convivenza, diciamola così, tra il diritto comunitario e i diritti dei singoli Stati europei? La ringrazio.
I start with the question of redistribution, because this is, as I mentioned in my presentation, literally the core. As a more liberal market economist, I say before we talk about redistribution, we have to talk about creating wealth, because you can only, it's simple, but it's often unfortunately forgotten. You have to create first something you can redistribute, and too much of the political debate on the national level and on the European level is about redistributing or distributing, not in producing wealth. So we have to see both sides of the equation, and yes, we talk about a lot about competitiveness. On the other side, we strangle a lot of initiatives by entrepreneurs, by other actors in the society to create new ideas and new wealth. So my focus and the focus of my party is more to enable people to create wealth before we discuss distributing the bait, so to say. There's a lot about the question, what is Europe, or what is the specific contribution of Europe in terms of social policy? As I mentioned, historically, this was not the level where we talked about social policy. Europe has now created, as inventive as they are, a lot of initiatives, less regulations, because they are not allowed for the moment, due to the constitutional settings, to do much in the social policy issue, because this is normally still with the nation state. But they find a lot of ways to get in, and there's some political forces, mainly on the socialist side, who want to have Europe more, give Europe more power, because they face opposition on the national level, and to try to go through the back door of Europe to impose regulations they are politically not able to implement on the national level. This is a very famous mechanism also in this issue of Green Deal, for example, because as they face opposition on the national level, they try to bring in these policy propositions on the European level, and Europe has now a lot of power, or the European Commission in particular, to have regulations or directives which is more or less national law, an immediate national law. So you must be very careful, and this is the chance or the opportunity for our political party to say, okay, be careful what you get if you vote for, because we do not want, as I mentioned, a super state Europe. I still believe that a lot of social justice issues should be regulated on the national level, because the diversity of the situations, of the values, of the level of development is with the nation state or even the regions. Well, your country and less my own home country is a good example, giving the huge difference. And you have a lot of experience in redistribution, by the way, between the north, for example, and the south of Italy. Not so successful, frankly speaking, if I may say so, because you have a lot of limits if you try to impose state regulations on redistribution, because you never know where it ends up in the very end. So this is where I also pledge for limits of politics. We always talk about what politics can do. I often ask myself, what can politics not do or should not do? There's always the illusion politics can solve each and every problem, and politicians, of course, like it, because that's what they are apparently voted for. But if you look more carefully and evaluate what really works, you come to the conclusion the impact is very limited, and a lot of things are unforeseeable. Because as I try to explain, you're acting in a very complex society. You throw a stone, so to say, in the society, but you don't have an idea what kind of waves you're creating throughout the whole society, and you end up with results who are completely different from, or contrary even to that what you initially wanted to achieve. So we have also to talk about limits of politics, and we have to leave things to others, other interesting or other actors in a society. It's not just the state or the company. That goes indeed on the subsidiarity principle, which is in the constitution of Europe, but is often offended. On Sunday, you hear people talking about, yes, Europe is something of subsidiarity. On Monday, they do quite the contrary. They do a lot of regulations which is against the principle. So even my own party, I should have a stronger focus on applying again this principle. We invented it, by the way. The Christian democracy is the origin of the idea of subsidiarity. It comes from the late 19th century. And it is the constitutional principle of the European Union. But in reality, it is not often the case that we really stick to this principle. And then, of course, the issue is, do we redistribute within Europe? We have huge funds. The whole funds for regional development is nothing else than redistribution. To some extent, if it comes, for example, to infrastructure, I think that Europe has a role to play to connect regions, but that doesn't mean that we go into national security systems and try to homogenize, to make it one. What we should enable on the other side is to create this idea of the free movements in Europe. I think this is a huge historical advantage, and everything which blocks this free exchange and moving around Europe is something the European Union has to address. This is the core idea of Europe, to make not only capital free, but also people. And if there are obstacles, and there are still a lot, by the way, we are far from any single market wherever you look. Look into the financial system. We have still very much national financial systems. If you try to operate transborder, you face a lot of challenges still. Labor mobility got something better. I think there's some progress made. I just moved from Germany to Belgium, for example. So I had to take all my revenues and my old age retirement schemes transferred. This now works quite well. This is a huge contribution for intra-European mobility, but I know a lot of other sectors where it's very difficult if you move from one country to the other. That comes with a lot of problems, also still in social justice issues with the family, for example, the children. So there is a lot of work to be done. But this is back to the idea of Europe of the 1950s, that we create a single market. And if they would focus on that, I think we would make much more progress than with all fancy ideas they have day out and day in.
Thank you, Peter. Ci sono ancora domande? Prego, sì.
La ringrazio molto e vorrei chiederle qualche chiarimento rispetto a un ambito particolare, quello dei giovani, le politiche sociali e l'istruzione. Mi sembra molto importante soprattutto per il futuro. Grazie.
Matteo.
Grazie Peter per la tua relazione, per aver accettato il nostro invito. Io ti chiedo, anche rispetto a quello che diceva Federico Reo la scorsa volta, se tu pensi che come dire, la richiesta dal punto di vista della giustizia sociale da parte delle classi medie, come lui ha evidenziato nella ricerca che avete fatto, sia da un certo punto di vista anche una disistima rispetto a quelli che sono i sistemi politici locali dello Stato. E poi ti chiedo, lui già accennava la scorsa volta, se pensi che ad esempio il Next Generation potrebbe essere un esempio di come l'Unione Europea prova a, come dire, occuparsi dei temi di giustizia o di welfare senza intervenire in modo preponderante, quindi allocando delle risorse con degli obiettivi definiti, ma che sono poi effettivamente gli Stati nazionali a decidere come realizzare in base a quelle che sono chiaramente le diversità di ciascuno.
Well, the last question regarding the youth goes back what I mentioned in creating opportunities rather than redistributing or trying to correct afterwards. I think education plays an important role, but there is, luckily I must say, no initiatives to homogenize or to introduce a European system. What we should do is enabling the exchange. I think not enough young people, in my opinion, still go to other countries. We have, of course, this Erasmus program, for example, but this is always still a tiny part of the young generation. I think Europe, this young generation should experience Europe as a space which is an important part of their life. Again, bringing down obstacles in moving from one place to the other is an issue which is originally with Europe and should be strengthened. But I don't think that Europe is able to substitute or to replace any national system for the moment. That would require a huge amount of money, and you know, we have already a very sensitive debate in Europe whether there should be European taxes. Nobody touches upon that issue, but if they continue as they do, they sooner or later come to the moment where we have to seriously think, do we need European tax? That is a death kill if you put this in the election campaign, because then you know what the reactions will be, that the Euroscepticism will grow much faster. But you have to be very careful if you demand new regulations, new initiatives. This needs resources, and for the moment it's the national states which decide to give resources to Europe. Europe has hardly any sources of its own to get money. It's a minor part of taxes and customs they still have, but this is not a major part. So we talk about new resources of Europe. If you really want to have Europe being more active, I would be very careful in these wishes of demanding more. They should carefully think what is really necessary to be done on the European level and have the courage to give things back to the nation state. And this is something I think we should not expect from the European Commission, because their interest is to get more and more. This is something the Parliament has to tap in, because they have to control these initiatives. But even the Parliament is often split in this respect. It's an interesting question now with the new results we going to expect after the 9th of June with a more, what some say, conservative majority. Will this might lead to the more critical review of what is done on the European level, or more demands to give things back? This we should have carefully observed in the time being. And your question on culture, you're fully right that social justice, the ideas are very much bound to local and national norms and values, and we cannot separate it from this context. It's not a technical exercise. It is about what people think, as I mentioned in my last comment, what vision they have about a society, how a society should look like. And this is not something which can be imposed from any other institution. This has to grow up, and it has to be accepted by the people. We talk about a lot of technical issues, but we lack the acceptance in our population, in our societies. And all this rise of the populist parties is a direct consequence that people feel not heard, that people think they impose things on our heads, and they are not standing behind that. So it's an issue, as long as we're talking about a democratic environment, we have to acknowledge that people have to accept it. And any measure implemented and not accepted by the people is highly inefficient. And we have a lot of examples that rules are posed for whatever reasons, but face a huge opposition. And just to take a more recent example, this huge protests in the agricultural sector, on the rural sector, is a typical example that for decades, I would say, these voices have not been heard. It's not an issue that there is not enough money. The agricultural budget of the European Union is still the largest. But do those really profit from that, or are we supporting others we do not want? So these are very critical questions, and you have to listen to people. This is a challenge Europe is constantly facing, and it's part, unfortunately, of the constitution of Europe as well, because we have only a very indirect system of representation. Yes, we vote for the European elections, but we do not vote for the Commission, which is the government of Europe. We do not vote for the Council, which is the second government of Europe. So there's always this claim, it's not democratic enough. Well, you cannot compare it with a national system. It's not fair to compare, because as long as the nation states are not willing to give up a lot of their powers, you have this mixed system which is not fully democratic or not directly democratic. So be careful one side demanding too much, because the bill comes afterwards, and I don't think that people will pay more taxes. At least you redistribute from the national level, and no nation state is in is currently able to give a higher portion of its national budget to Europe and is not willing. And on the other side, think about implementation and acceptance of politics. And this has not grown in the last years. There's a lot of skepticism. And this is sometimes the fault if you centralize decisions and do not communicate why you do this. So there is also lacks indeed of political communication, which is a wide field we can discuss about.
Ci sono ancora domande? Michele? No. Allora, io ringrazio molto Peter Hefele, direi che ci ha fatto capire sicuramente che l'Europa non è un terreno, una società semplice. Al contrario invece presenta appunto complessità e differenziazioni che devono essere riconosciute, devono essere rispettate, specialmente se l'Europa vuole continuare a essere nel mondo un faro di libertà, come dicono anche i trattati di Lisbona, se non sbaglio, e di rispetto dei diritti umani, naturalmente. E questo ci fa anche capire che ai vari livelli della giustizia sociale che oggi abbiamo passato anche molto in rassegna, è necessario cercare una condivisione in ogni caso. Non bisogna mollare nel cercare una condivisione che sia fra i popoli realmente, non soltanto del livello materiale, ma anche e forse soprattutto del livello ideale. E quindi io ringrazio di questo Peter e rimando, specialmente diciamo per entrare ancora più dentro su questo piano, all'incontro di oggi pomeriggio con Gigi De Palo, che ci parlerà di famiglia e welfare. E allora vi invito al pranzo che abbiamo qui sotto alle 13:15, in realtà abbiamo ancora qualche minuto, e poi alle 15, alle 3 di oggi pomeriggio ci diamo appuntamento qua per l'incontro del pomeriggio. Ringraziamo ancora Peter e la nostra interprete dottoressa Salemi e vi raccomandiamo di consegnare le cuffie all'uscita al personale di sala.